Right, so Act 1, Scene 2 then starts off in the street, and Capulet, that's Lord Capulet, Juliet's dad, is there with Paris. This is the first time we meet Paris. We'll find out a bit more about him in a second. And a servant. Now, Capulet says, "But Montague is bound as well as I, in penalty alike, and 'tis not hard, I think, for men so old as we to keep the peace." So, in other words, what he's saying is that Montague, like I, is stuck in a similar punishment, and it's easy, I think, for old men like the two of us to be friends. So this goes back to what happened in Act 1, Scene 1, where the prince said, if there's ever a kick-off in the streets again, your lives will pay the price. And Capulet is obviously continuing a conversation here that he had been having with Paris, where he's talking about it and saying, you know what, just like me, Montague is going to, be in big trouble if there's any more fighting, so it should be quite easy for us not to fight. Paris says, "Of honourable reckoning are you both, and pity 'tis you lived at odds so long. But now, my lord, what say you to my suit?" So what he's basically saying here is, you're both good men, it's a shame that you were enemies for so long, but anyway, what do you say about my offer? And I think this is quite interesting because Capulet is talking about his problems that he's having, and Paris basically says, yeah, that's okay, it's a shame. Now, back to business, what do you say about my offer? And this is the first glimpse of Paris, I think, as being a bit self-centered, because you'll see in a second who Paris is, and the audience, it's important with Shakespeare's writing that we don't like Paris too much. So Capulet then says, "But saying over what I said before, my child is yet a stranger in the world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride." So we realise now that what Paris is after is to marry Juliet. And we know from the prologue that Romeo is going to fall in love with Juliet. So right away we have a real conflict, because in Act 1, Scene 1, we discovered that Romeo at the moment is in love with Rosaline. In Act 1, Scene 2, we're learning that Paris wants to marry Juliet, and yet we think, well, hang on, in the prologue, we learnt that Romeo would end up with Juliet. So there's a lot that has to sort of unravel in the plot before we get there. So what is Capulet saying here? He's saying, well, repeating what I've already said, my child is too young. She's not even 14. So in other words, Juliet is 13 years old in this play, which catches a lot of people by surprise. They don't realise that. And that is quite a fascinating insight. I will analyse some importance about that age and the age of people when they got married in Elizabethan England and today in the analysis video coming in a few days. But or it's next in the playlist if you're watching this and it's already done. But for now, let's leave it at that. So he basically says, let her get a couple of years older before she is ready to marry. And Paris says, younger than she are happy mothers made. In other words, there are girls younger than 14 who have had children and, are happy. So he's arguing back with Juliet's dad, which seems a bit crazy, really, to say, come on, she's not too young. And Capulet says, and too soon marred are those so early made. The earth has swallowed all my hopes but she is the hopeful lady of my earth. But woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart, my will to her consent is but a part. Now, let's just check this. There we go. So what that bit means is that those young girls who get married so long, it ruins their lives. All my hope has gone apart from her. She is so important to me. And then this bit, but woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart. Now, to woo means to sort of pursue someone, to flirt with them, to try and, make them fall in love with you. So he's saying to Paris, seek her perfection, seek her affection, and Paris, to make her fall in love with you. Me saying that you can marry her is only part of it. My will to her consent is but a part. Now, there's a lot in this which will come up in the next video about the sort of context of parents deciding who their children marry and that kind of thing. But, Capulet is here saying, look, what I want is only part of the deal. So you spend some time with Juliet and try and impress her. And then if she wants to marry you, that's great. And that's what he basically goes on to say here. And she agree within her scope of choice lies my consent and fair according voice. This night I hold an old accustomed feast, whereto I have invited many a guest, such as I love, and you among the store one more, most welcome makes my number more. At my poor house look to behold this night earth-treading stars that make dark heaven light, such comfort as do lusty young men feel when well-apparelled April on the heel of limping winter treads, even such delight among fresh female buds shall you see this night. Inherit at my house, hear all see, and like her most whose merit most shall be, which on my view of many mine being one, may stand in number, though in reckoning none. Come, go with me. So what's he saying here? There's a lot being said, but what he's saying is, if Juliet agrees to marry you, that's good by me. Tonight I'm having a party at my house, a feast. I've invited lots of guests, lots of people that I love, and I will add one more to that list. That's you. Come to my house tonight. You'll see lots of stars. And this bit here is quite interesting because what he's saying is that men love to see beautiful women. Um, in winter they like to see spring. So in other words, men who haven't had women like are desperate for women, but come to my house and see lots of other beautiful women, and then you can make your mind up over whether you really love Juliet. So have a look around, and you'll see lots of beautiful women, and then my daughter may not seem so important. Come with me. And of course, this is a massive similarity to in the previous scene, the conversation with Romeo about the same party as well, where Benvolio basically says to Romeo, you're in love with Rosaline, but come to this party, I'll show you other beautiful women, and after seeing other beautiful women, you won't think her so beautiful. So Shakespeare here is making a connection between the character of Paris and Romeo. We see them almost as sort of parallel characters, um, sort of neck and neck in the battle for love, both going to this party tonight to be persuaded in some ways that perhaps their feelings of love and affection are not, um, so genuine or so real or important. And then he says to a servant, and he gives him a paper, go, sirrah, trudge about through fair Verona, find those persons out whose names are written there, and to them say, my house and welcome on their pleasure stay. In other words, he says to the servant, here's a list of names, find the people in the city, invite them to the party, and then he leaves with Paris. Then we have a slightly comic moment. I think Shakespeare is a real sort of master of structure, and he doesn't want to leave things dull or tense or scary or sad or happy for too long, so he mixes up the emotions. And here we have the servant saying, find them out whose names are written here. It is written that the shoemaker should meddle with his yard, and the tailor with his last, the fisher with his pencil, and the painter with his nets. But I am sent to find those persons whose names are here writ, and can never find what names the writing person here hath writ. I must to the learned in good time. So what's the basically saying is, I've got to find the names written here. It has been said that people should try out different things, but I am sent to find these people written here, and I can't even read. I need to find somebody who can read, and they'll be able to help me. And then, with perfect timing, Benvolio and Romeo come in. So the servant is stood in the same position at this point. And Benvolio says, tut, man, one fire burns out another's burning, one pain is lessened by another's anguish. Turn giddy and be holp by backward turning, one desperate grief cures with another's languish. Take thou some new infection to the eye, and the rank poison of the old will die. So what's he saying? He's saying you can put one fire out by starting another. When we feel pain, if we forget our previous pain. And this bit's quite funny about turn giddy and be holp by backward turning. A clever image from Shakespeare who's saying, if you get dizzy, then you can spin back round the other way and stop that dizziness. I think that's quite good. And he says, focus on someone else. Take what is infecting your eye and look at someone else, and the old poison will die. And here is a metaphor now of poison, which will continue through the next few lines. But basically, he's continuing his argument. Look, you'll soon forget Rosaline by looking and falling in love for someone else. Then Romeo says, your plantain leaf is excellent for that. Now, the plantain leaf was a leaf that was used as a kind of bandage or a plaster, like a sticking plaster. And he's basically, arguing that you can't put a plaster on, um, a serious wound. In other words, you're not going to be able to solve this. Benvolio says, for what, I pray thee? For what? And Romeo says, for your broken skin. So he's saying, a plaster's good for broken skin, but it can't be used to mend a bone. In other words, the solution to the problem here is not half kind of good enough. And then Benvolio says, why Romeo? Aren't thou mad? He's basically saying, are you mad, Romeo? With this kind of elaborate metaphor here. And Romeo says, not mad, but bound more than a madman is. Shut up in prison, kept without my food, whipped and tormented, and God then good fellow. So what he says is, I'm not mad, but I am tied up and confined more than a madman is. And so Romeo says he's locked up, starved, abused, and tortured. So he's basically saying, I'm having a really hard time. And of course, it's all a metaphor. It's all emotional in the way he's feeling because of his unreturned love from Rosaline. And then the servant who was just talking to Capulet comes in and says, God Gigodden, I pray, sir, can you read? So he basically says, hiya, do you know how to read? And Romeo says, I, mine own fortune in my misery. In other words, yes, I can read my own fortune, like a fortune teller, and it's bad. And the servant, and this is another comic moment, so it's seriousness interspersed with comedy, which, is a one way of keeping all of the audience entertained. So, some people who enjoy the jokes more would be entertained by this. And it's a good mix, this play. It's one of the reasons it's so successful. And then the servant says, perhaps you have learned it without book, but I pray, can you read anything you see? In other words, he's saying, well, you may have learned to read people's fortunes without actually reading words. So can you read words? And Romeo, with a bit of banter, a bit of bants, as they say, says, I, if I know the letters and the language. In other words, yes, I can read if it's the right language, if it's the language that I know. And the servant says, you say honestly, rest you merry. In other words, that's the truth. Have a good day. So he's kind of worked out he's being wound up and he's going to leave. And Romeo says, stay, fellow, I can read. So he's saying, oh, come on, I'm only winding you up. Give it here, I'll read it for you. And then he reads the letter that was written, just previously. And here it is. This is Capulet's letter. Signor Martino and his wife and daughters, County Alsam, and his beauteous sisters, the lady widow of Vitravio, Signor Placentio and his lovely nieces, Mercutio and his brother Valentine, mine uncle Capulet, his wife and daughters, my fair niece Rosaline, Livia, Signor Valentino and his cousin Tybalt, Lucio and the lively Helena, a fair assembly, whither should they come? So this is a long list of all the people invited to this party. And you'll notice one of them is Rosaline, who is the very lady that Romeo is in love with. So that is obviously quite interesting. And he says, this is a good group of people. Where are they supposed to go? The servant says, up. And Romeo says, whither? Like, where? And the servant says, to supper, to our house. In other words, to eat at our house. Romeo says, whose house? And the servant says, my master's. So here the servant is getting his own back a bit on Romeo and winding Romeo up with his questions. So it's like a double act now. And Romeo says, indeed, I should have asked you that before. So he's saying, obviously, this is all obvious. And the servant says, now I'll tell you without asking, my master is the great rich Capulet, and if you be not of the house of Montagues, I pray, come and crush a cup of wine, rest you merry. So he's saying, well, I'll tell you then. My boss is the amazing, rich Lord Capulet, Juliet's dad, that is. And as long as you're not one of the Montague family, in other words, if you're anybody except our enemy, the Montagues, then come along and have a drink. And, have a nice day. And then he leaves. So, of course, Romeo's reaction to that should be, well, I'm a Montague, so I won't go to that because I'm not really invited, but you can imagine what happens. So Benvolio says, at this same ancient feast of Capulet sups the fair Rosaline, whom thou so lovest, with all the admired beauties of Verona. Go thither, and with untainted eye compare her face with some that I shall show, and I will make thee think thy swan a crow. So, what's he saying? He's saying, at this party of Capulets, Rosaline's going to be there, that's the one you're in love with, but there are also going to be loads of other pretty women from the city. Go there and objectively compare Rosaline to the other women, and I will show you that compared to other women, Rosaline is ugly. Well, Romeo, of course, isn't going to accept that. He says, when the devout religion of mine eye maintains such falsehood that then turns tears to fires, and these who often drown could never die, transparent heretics be burnt for liars, when fairer than my love, the all-seeing sun never saw her match since the first world begun. So what's he saying here is quite a confusing bit, but he's basically saying when my eyes lie to me in this way, so if I do see someone more beautiful than Rosaline, which is obviously a lie, my eyes would just be lying to me because nobody is more beautiful than Rosaline, then let my tears turn to fire and my eyes burn up for being liars. One more lovely than Rosaline, he says, the sun itself never saw anybody as beautiful as her since the world began. So in other words, anywhere in the world, because the sun goes all over the world, since the beginning of time, there has never been somebody as beautiful as Rosaline. Hey, that rhymed. I'm like Shakespeare myself. So really over-the-top dramatic points from Romeo here, and tying in with the video previously on how Romeo is this sort of fickle, tragic hero. This backs that up a bit because he's just simply ridiculously over-dramatic and unrealistic in the things he says. That for all of time, all across the world, there's never been someone as beautiful as Rosaline. Benvolio says, touch, you saw her fair, none else being by, herself poised with herself in either eye, but in that crystal scales let there be weighed your lady's love against some other maid. That I will show you shining at this feast, and she shall scant show well now that she now shows best. So what's he saying? He's saying, you know what, you thought that she was pretty because there was no one else there. You just had her to look at. But if you compare her to other pretty women that I will show you at this party, she isn't going to look so impressive. So he's challenging Romeo here, really. Now, Benvolio is a very interesting character because previously he was the voice of reason, wasn't he, in Act 1, Scene 1. He was trying to break up the fight, and he was trying to be, a good person. And he seems a good person, as he says to Romeo's mum and dad, I'll go and speak to Romeo, I'll find out what's wrong with him. But here we see a little bit of craziness in the character, because he's just heard from the servant that this is, of course, the Capulet feast, and everyone's welcome except Montague's. But he says, come on, let's go to it. So I think that's quite interesting, and obviously in terms of dramatic structure, this is building up to, some big event. We can feel the tension mounting. The fight of Act 1, Scene 1 was but a prelude, was but a warm-up. We can feel that something big is going to happen. And then Romeo says, I'll go along, no such sight to be shown, but to rejoice in splendour of mine own. So in other words, he says, I will go to this party, not to see the sort of other women, but to just see my Rosaline, who I love.